Okay, welcome to our second Wednesdays with Women's Genders and Sexuality Studies. I'm Melissa Kravitz. I'm one of the co-directors of the minor. This is a minor here on campus. If you are interested in knowing more about it, you can talk to me at the end of the talk. Dr. Erin Wagner is the other minor director, is unable to be here today because of a faculty meeting. Wednesdays with Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies is a kind of programming series we have, and we often hear from faculty, sometimes from alumni, students, and staff. So today, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Greg Moll, who is Assistant Professor of History, and I am very excited to have him talk today about the woman question, marriage, misogyny, and sexual liberation in the early modern age. Dr. Moll teaches early modern history, especially 19th century European history and economic history. He got his PhD in 2016 from UNC, University of North Carolina. And he's a good friend of mine, and I appreciate him doing this for me. And it's okay that he was late. Thanks, Dr. Moll.
Some say building anticipation. Also, do we know how to dim the house lights a little bit so you can all see this?
I don't.
Well, that could be a problem. Folks, while we're dealing with the lighting issue, I'm Dr. Moll. Thank you, Dr. Kravitz, for the introduction. So far, you see a faint outline behind you that hopefully will be stronger in a second. I realize that probably you didn't plan on spending your Wednesday discussing a literary debate from the late Middle Ages to the early modern period, a debate that deals... Actually, can it be the other way? Can it darken this so they can get better contrast and light up in the...
Didn't say I was good at it.
So I realize, again, you probably didn't expect to be spending a Wednesday hearing about a literary debate. But I promise you bawdy pictures. I promise you an occasional witch hunting episode or vignette. The occasional witticism, too, from a variety of writers. And I'm just going to... Sounds good.
Better.
It looks great to me. So what I'm talking about today, and I'm going to leave the phrase the woman question in the original French because this was a debate that occurred first in the French court and then spilled out throughout the rest of Europe. This is called the Querelle des Femmes. It is a late medieval, early modern debate that ends up kind of covering a lot of the key capitals, the key cities, the key seats of power in Europe. And so what I want you to think of yourselves as doing today is going on this panoramic tour of a kind of up and down cycle of the way people are representing women in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. A cycle that will see some precipitous lows, upticks in misogyny or kind of contempt toward women. A cycle that will see, I forgot I have this thing and I like to flail my arms, so this could potentially be interesting in a few minutes. A cycle, too, that will see some real highs in the representation of women, which will actually coincide, too, with moments where some pretty important female figures are holding positions of power during the period in question. So we're going to start in France, at the Royal Court of France, again in the late Middle Ages. We are going to take a detour through to the Holy Roman Empire and witness the witch-hunting ravings of a mad, or at the very least, preoccupied monk. We're going to stroll through the pleasure gardens of the Italian Renaissance. Eventually, we are going to make our way up to Scotland, where we will hear a fire and brimstone speech by John Knox, who's the founder of Presbyterianism, before we finally round out our trip and end up back in France in the 17th and 18th century, where we will see new forms of sociability emerging and women playing a really important role there. So what I want you to do while you're taking this panoramic tour is I want you to ask yourselves questions like, when it comes to, say, misogyny, anti-women sentiment, is that changing over time? Is it staying the same? Is that sentiment perhaps targeting certain sectors of the female population, or is it a kind of wholesale condemnation of women? Likewise, when we see moments during this literary debate of women kind of being idolized, of attempts to, we hesitate to use the word feminism, which is a very modern concept, but writings on behalf of women. How are they defending female status? Are these writings, again, trying to defend all women? How are they defining womanhood, too, and defining the concept of gender? Is it a kind of physical construct, a cultural construct, a biblical construct with references to Old Testament? So I want you to kind of keep those questions in mind. I will refer back to them, and hopefully by the conclusion I have a map up here, but really this should be a roller coaster. What this literary elite debate will be is a kind of up and down moment. Highs for the representation of women, and some really big lows that will coincide with moments of violence. So hopefully that sells you on you should spend some time with someone who came in late and drank a lot of coffee right before this time, so should be high for about 20 minutes before having his own precipitous drop. I want to begin, before we even get into this debate, with a tradition that kind of precedes what I'm talking about today, and that is the courtly love tradition. You're probably familiar with King Arthur. The courtly love tradition, I think one of the best representations of it comes from the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. And in the courtly love tradition, typically there's a focus on love between noblemen and noble women. And one of the common literary devices here is that typically the love's between kind of slightly higher status noblewoman, someone who's slightly lower than she is. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is the courtly love tradition, it doesn't give women a terrible amount of agency. But it is a fairly, in some, kind of positive depiction of womanhood. Women in these courtly love stories are typically objects of adulation. Again, they aren't really subjects in these stories. But generally speaking, we have a kind of positive depiction. I'll give you an example of a fairly famous courtly love poem. This is by Chaucer, the famed English writer. Tell me, can we actually see this in the back, or is this... Okay, take a look at it. If this is indecipherable, that's not a problem. I will tell you exactly what this leads to, or what this boils down to. And I will use this moment to get my last intake of coffee while you're checking out Chaucer's claims. Again, you're struggling to make out what his core argument is or his core theme. Chaucer here is prostrating himself at the altar of love. He is deeply, overwhelmingly, in this Ballad to Rosamond, our character here is deeply, overwhelmingly in love. Perhaps a slightly less romantic story when you realize this statement right here. He's comparing the thickness of his love to gelatin, which is a jelly that you put on fish. Again, a slightly less romantic device. I thought that was pretty funny, but I'm getting it only from the faculty members here as little chuckles. Look, the takeaway is there's a long tradition of, generally speaking, portraying women in positive lights, but not really giving them much agency in these stories. And this is our kind of starting point for what we're looking at today. Because this debate over women, this women's question that I'm interested in, it starts when we move away from the courtly tradition and start to go in some new directions. And so the real starting point for that divergence is another story that begins with the courtly tradition, the courtly love tradition, called The Romance of the Rose. This is a kind of two-part story. It's written by two authors, and it's separated. One of them dies, and it kind of lies dormant for a while, and then the story is taken up by another author, Jean de Meun. And what's interesting about this story is the first half of it or so is very typical courtly romance. The second half of it, where Jean de Meun kind of jumps into the mix, kind of goes in a very different direction. So Jean de Meun, he's writing in The Romance of the Rose about kind of penetrating to the inner sanctum of a woman. The rose is meant to be a very thinly veiled sexual reference here. But more than that, he turns this into kind of an encyclopedia. Jean de Meun kind of cites every major thinker of the time, populates this story with ancient fables and mythology, kind of shows off a little bit. And if that's not stuffing it too much, at the end of this story, what Jean de Meun does is kind of just go completely off in a very misogynistic conclusion, where he really attacks the institution of marriage. He specifically attacks the role of women within the institution of marriage, kind of displaying them as foul temptresses, overly sexualized. And so this is really the starting points of this women's debate, because Jean Demune's writing, it circulates quite broadly, and a number of prominent writers, including a number of prominent women writers, feel a need to respond to, again, this rather off-the-wall conclusion that takes what was once a kind of nice traditional chivalric romance and turn it into a kind of hotbed of misogyny. And so our starting point for this women's debate is really the response to what Jean Demune writes in the late Middle Ages. And so that brings us to our kind of first big figure on the roller coaster ride. This is Christine de Pizan. Has anyone heard of Christine de Pizan before? Yeah, I know the medievalist in the room has heard, and the head of the Women and Gender Studies. Okay, so Christine de Pizan is an Italian-born French poet. And she's kind of an artist in residence at the royal court of France in the Middle Ages or the early modern period. She sees what Jean Demune writes, as again do some other scholars. If you ever walk into Rotunda, you might notice a quote by Jean Gasson, who is, he's talking about, in this case, Joan of Arc. He's another of these French scholars who feels a need to kind of respond to the misogyny that's in the Romance of the Rose. But Christine de Pizan is quite unique at the time in that she's a female artist in residence. She's a respected scholar at the French court. You can see some images of her, or maybe you can faintly make out those images. Here she is reading to a group or lecturing to a group of male scholars. Here she is presenting her writings to the Queen of France. So this was a scholar who also had considerable clout. And so Christine de Pizan, I think, launching our first little attack against the culture of misogyny set in place by Jean Demune, she publishes this book in 1405 called The Book of the City of the Ladies. This is a book that imagines a kind of allegorical city that is inhabited by the famous women, especially of mythology. And within this city, with these notable women, Christine de Pizan slowly but surely attacks the misogynistic arguments of Jean Demune, and she shows the virtues of womanhood in the process. And she's not restricting herself to just criticizing a book. She uses this book as a launching pad to make some bigger political and social claims on behalf of women, too. So I'm going to give you a few quotes here. Show of hands if people can read that, too. Yep, excellent. Here, of course, taking on the idea of men and women kind of having opposite or distinctive spheres of competence, distinctive abilities, or are these kind of socially and culturally constructed? Here taking on one of the most common tropes used in diatribes against women, which is the Adam and Eve story, in particular the creation story, and this won't be the last time that we see this. Here, Christine de Pizan portraying this as a relationship of equals, rather than one of subordination. And of course, taking on the institution of marriage as well. And Christine de Pizan, this is a much longer book than the two quotes I'm giving you, but Christine de Pizan also attacks the institution of Salic law, which in France sees all inheritance going through the male. She again uses this response to a kind of misogynistic French scholar to launch a much more programmatic assault against the subordination of women. Now you're probably saying to yourself, what's next? What is the kind of, or maybe you're just saying to yourself, when does this end? One of the devices that Christine de Pizan uses in this story, and this is going to be another really important device that gets reused time and time again during this debate over womanhood, is she really fixates on what we call women worthies. I want you to pay attention here because she's not trying to necessarily defend all women. And she's not necessarily beyond kind of questioning the institution of marriage or Salic law or things like that. She's not making a kind of wholesale attack like we might associate with kind of a modern feminist program. She's really trying to showcase women worthy of emulation. Women who are models of virtue, who can each selectively be used to break down the arguments, again, that you see in something like The Romance of the Rose. This will be something that we see countless times during this debate, people coming back to the idea of not defending all women, but instead defending a few women that they see emblematic of nobility and virtue, and using that to attack misogynistic arguments. Now, I promised you some body pictures, and we will get to that right now. If you allow me for a second to move away from France and go to what is at the time called the Holy Roman Empire, but it's Germany today. We are going to see how this debate starts to shift now. So first we have a kind of courtly set of arguments in France. Now the stakes are going to get a bit higher as we move across the Rhine. And so I present to you the guy on the screen here. His name's Heinrich Kramer. And this guy is a monk on a mission. And his mission is to raise alarm bells throughout Europe about the threat posed by witches. And he raises such significant alarm in all of this. He, in fact, publishes a book that I'm going to mention on the next slide that kind of lays out to people the problem being posed by witchcraft or the threat being posed by it. He raises such a stink that in the 16th and 17th century, there is an orgy of witch persecutions that leads to the death of 80,000 women over about an 80-year period. So this guy is kind of launching us into a realm that isn't just a literary debate now, but he's publishing a book that leads in no small part to violence. Here's his book, published in 1486. It's called the Malleus Maleficarum. Any Latin speakers want to throw out their expertise here? The Hammer of Witches. Take a look at a quote from this. So I told you over the course of this cycle of kind of misogyny or defense of womanhood, I want to see if there are kind of consistencies or if we're seeing shifts. The problem, as far as Heinrich Kramer sees it, is that women are more susceptible to becoming witches because they are more carnal, which is to say they are more sexually charged, more prone to seduction. And this is an idea written again by a kind of witch-obsessed monk that ends up dramatically changing popular attitudes toward women. In fact, I'm going to show you, yes?
When you say more prone to seduction, do you mean more prone to being seduced or more prone to being the seducer?
Well, first, I didn't write it. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, so that is a very important distinction. It's a little of both, but generally it's being more prone to seduction. And very important because, case in point, what witchcraft is defined by is really a perversion of the natural order. Case in point, we have here an etching from a later edition of the Malleus Maleficarum where you can see someone stomping on the cross, right? Rather than it being venerated, we are desecrating a holy symbol. More importantly, though, the crime of witchcraft is really a crime of seduction whereby the would-be witch ends up being seduced by a demon or a witch already, someone who's already a witch, and sells their soul in the process. And so a key element of witchcraft accusations is the idea that one is more prone to being sexual. Sexuality is a huge part of the witchcraft process. Case in point, you might wonder what this weird picture of a small guy thrumming a violin here is. This is a depiction of a Black Sabbath, not the Ozzy Osbourne band, but instead the Holy Day for Witches. And Black Sabbaths, again, if you think of witchcraft as a perversion of the natural order, when you go to church, it is a somber ceremony. What witches do, they begin their period of worship with bawdy, sexually charged moments. A Black Sabbath is a sexual affair. They are dancing in a raucous way and then will eventually have intercourse as the beginning of their rituals. So we're seeing women as more prone to seduction and therefore more prone to engage in the acts that we associate with witchcraft. Let's look at one more etching to kind of hammer that point home before we shift locations. One of my favorite witchcraft pictures. Any idea what's going on here? This woman is about to kiss a demon or the devil on the anus. Which again, if we understand witchcraft as a perversion of the natural order rather than a kiss on the mouth, the osculum infame, as it's called, the shameful kiss. See, I bet you didn't think a literary debate discussion would involve someone kissing a devil on the anus. This is kind of the beginning of a Black Sabbath ceremony. This, what is meant to be a kind of cold, submissive move, launches this perversion of the natural sexual order. If you take all of these etchings together, the point I'm trying to make is that Kramer changes the understanding of womanhood to be highly sexually charged, or puts that out into the public sphere. And that women are, as a result, highly suspect because of their sexuality, seen as prone to temptation, seen as prone to seduction. And even if that's not leading to witchcraft accusations, it leads to a very critical reassessment of womanhood. Let me leave behind this body picture. And let us move to the pleasure gardens of Italy, where I think we might see a response to the kind of ideas put out by a Heinrich Kramer, that women are overly sexualized, prone to temptation. I present to you Margherita Fonte, who is a Renaissance writer. Perhaps her most famous work, published posthumously, is called The Worth of Women. And this is a tale that has several women, young and old, talking about the institution of marriage. In particular, there's a young woman in this story who's kind of swept away by her suitor, and she's explaining how much in love she is. And the other women involved in this story are quite critical of marriage in general, and men specifically. And so they use this discussion to talk not only about marriage, but also about the difference between men and women. Take a look right here. I ask you if there's consistency in the defense of women over time, or changes in all of that. Margherita Fonte, in a way, is going back to that myth of Adam and Eve, or that story of Adam and Eve, and the way it's used to talk about differences in gender. So Christine de Pizan has this quote I showed you where she is saying that we don't take out of the Adam and Eve story a sense that men are better than women. Margherita Fonte is going even one step further. If you see here, the idea that men were created before women isn't a status symbol. In fact, men come out of the earth, the dust, but women come out of ribs, and therefore a higher status made out of something living. Some of this goes to extremes, and it's meant to be that way. It's meant to be very satirical. As a result, kind of going farther, perhaps, than Margherita Fonte really feels, but doing that as a way of provoking a bigger discussion. So here again, we have two women engaging in this discussion with a younger woman about the institution of marriage, the status of womanhood. And you can see here, I think, taking this to an extreme, talking about the decency of men, you would as well look for blood in a corpse as for the last shred of decency in a man, meant to be over the top, this kind of explanation. This is another story that really takes advantage of the idea of woman-worthies. It is not meant to rescue womanhood in general. It is meant instead to challenge misogyny, to challenge in particular the changes brought about by people like Heinrich Kramer, by showing that there are women worthy of adulation, and using them as a way of reimagining the virtues of females as a whole. Now, I promised you some crazed Scots. John Knox is the founder of Presbyterianism. And in addition to founding Presbyterianism, he is in Scotland, but he is looking down at events in England. At a time in his life, Queen Elizabeth I becomes Queen of England. And John Knox writes quite a bit about the status of women or the potential of women to be rulers, to exercise political authority. Let's take a look at one of his quotes. Again, I ask you, what are the kind of framing devices used throughout this? What are the ways of understanding the concept of womanhood and the ways of promoting that concept or disparaging it? Here, John Knox is discussing the idea of it being against the natural order that a woman should hold positions of power. Let's see what else he has to say. This is hard to read in the older kind of Scots English. It's helpful, of course, that John Knox isn't a particularly subtle writer, and his message kind of slaps you in the face. Here he is at the top of this screen. I hope you can imagine, just as he is feverishly speaking about his new religion, so too is he speaking with such vehemence about, again, the upturning of the natural order of things, that the weak should lead the strong. The blind, the sick should lead those who are healthy and can see. Before we go back to France, which is where I said I want to round up this discussion, I hope, again, you're keeping in mind this image of a roller coaster. There's a kind of back and forth here, moments of highs in defense of women. Typically, again, not defending all of womanhood, but instead really fixating on the virtues of a few select women. Rare is it we're getting a wholesale defense of women, and in particular, rare is it that we're getting a defense of women outside the noble class. I ask you too, before we shift, to think a little bit about misogyny. Has it primarily been the same kind of story, decrying women based on kind of biological difference or physical difference? Has it been a kind of cultural critique? Has it been a mix of all of these? Let us talk now in the 17th century. We're going to round out this discussion by looking a little bit at what's going on in France in the 17th and even the 18th century. By the 17th century, we have kind of new forms of sociability. And what I mean by that is people are gathering together at the homes of well-off folks, and they are using these gatherings as an opportunity to debate the issues of the day. Debate in particular literature, but also some of the civic problems they see. We call this in the 17th century a ruelle. And ruelle is simply French. This is happening predominantly in France. A ruelle is simply the space between a wall and a bed. And the reason we call these gatherings ruelle is, well, you can probably guess, these debates are happening, initially at least, within this space between walls and beds. What's important here is that women are kind of hostesses of intellectual gatherings. Some of them are dominated by women, but some of them also include men. And so women are starting to kind of carve out a place for themselves, not only by writing literature on their own behalf, like Christine de Pizan, but also by overseeing gatherings of the great minds of the day. And in particular, carving out for themselves a role in harmonizing debates, in ensuring that people discuss the issues of the day with a civil tone. and a sociable tongue. Here you can see this quote here, according to the poet Jean Chapelain, saying the ruelle is a space where there's no other place in the world where good sense reigns more. This will be a precursor if you study the 18th century, if you've ever studied the 18th century. Women continue to occupy a major role in overseeing literary gatherings, especially in France, but throughout Europe during the 18th century. No longer do we call them ruelles in the 18th century, we instead call them salons. So of course you talk about a salon today as a place where you get your nails done, but in the 18th century, a salon again was the place to be if you wanted to discuss the issues of the day. And women carve out a space for themselves, not necessarily in this point as writers of new things, but instead as moderators of elite discussions. And if I throw more pictures in here, you could see Ben Franklin in a salon in the late 18th century. Many of our major figures of the Enlightenment, they are attending these gatherings, using them to launch new ideas, using them to criticize institutions that don't make sense, using these to really get their arguments out there. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there were some people who were starting to attack the idea of physical difference between men and women, too. And so case in point, in this same 17th century France, where we have elite gatherings moderated by women, we have this priest named François Poulain de la Barre. He's a student of Descartes. If you know nothing about Descartes, well, if you took geometry at one point, or if you took anything with an XY axis, you can thank Descartes for that. You look fearful of that point. He's one of the fathers of modern mathematics. He's also one of the fathers of modern philosophy. Descartes is famous for the line, "I think, therefore I am." Descartes is really fixated on the idea of having an unassailable truth. So François Poulain de la Barre, in that tradition, takes on the issue of gender difference. And he has this very famous line that I think we should put in the context of the ruelle, put in the context of women exercising authority as moderators over elite debate, where he says, sure, we can see physical difference between men and women, but when it comes to the actual realm of intellection, when it comes to the realm of the mind, there is no sex. Of course, he's saying this not in the 19th century or the 20th century using modern biology or modern science to make these claims, but we were starting to get some physical arguments as well by the time we get into the 17th century when it comes to conceptualizing gender difference, or similarities between the gender. And this is a striking picture of this guy that I found on Google. He kind of looks like a vampire. Let us conclude, before we get to the final conclusion here, let us remember, again, I want you to keep the roller coaster in mind. That for every high, for every moment where people are striking out in defense of womanhood, there's a kind of response, a precipitous drop. And so these ruelles, these meetings of the mind moderated by famous women, they attract quite a bit of criticism in the 17th century. There is an obsession among the French nobility in reasserting noble status and realigning or connecting noble status to men to kind of question the authority or the right of women to hold these elite gatherings. The ruelles also become kind of objects of ridicule. So case in point, Molière, who's a famous French playwright, he writes this one play in the 17th century, The Affected Ladies, Les Précieux Ridicules, where he has this quote that I think makes fun of the entire affair of holding elite discussions. What do you think of my little goose? Do you find it goes with my outfit? What Molière is kind of doing in here is talking about how insincere, lacking in seriousness these ruelles are, and by extension, women are. Now you might be asking yourself, why does any of this matter? I'm going to tell you what I think are some general trends I've laid out, and then I'm going to ask you again to consider some potential conclusions we can have from what I hope to you is a back and forth, up and down affair over the status and the concept of womanhood over centuries and in a variety of different places. So, first and foremost, this querelle des femmes, this women question, it has no clear trajectory. It's not linear. It's not a story of progress for women. It's not necessarily a story of a kind of downward spiral. It's back and forth, varies by context, varies by time period. I think what's important to realize, and here is maybe one of the lessons for today, is that just as we look at this debate over time and realize that there's no linearity with it, that instead we get moments of extreme prejudice coinciding with moments of extreme and very full-throated defenses leveled on behalf of women. And that the two don't need to be mutually exclusive, even within a narrow elite society. I think the other thing, and here we need to then ask ourselves the bigger conclusion question, which is what I want to say to you. What I've talked to you today about is really an elite debate. Heinrich Kramer, certainly when he's alarming everybody about this witch threat in Europe, those ideas certainly do move beyond elite society. Especially when it leads to a witch craze in the 16th and 17th century that sees tens of thousands of people killed for the crime of witchcraft. But generally speaking, your average peasant isn't reading Christine de Pizan. Generally speaking, even a somewhat well-off merchant isn't going to a Ruelle. And so this is a debate, again, that's taking place within a kind of elite context. What I want you to take away from this kind of narrow and elite debate is a few things beyond of what I have here. There's no one story of misogyny over this time period. Sometimes it's a claim being leveled against womanhood in general. Sometimes it's a claim or a contempt that's really fixating on the sexuality of women. Sometimes it's a claim fixating on their nature, on their ability to lead or not to lead. Likewise, there's no one story in defense of women. I told you at the beginning I hesitate to use, we wouldn't use in the context of the 15th century, the 16th century, the 17th century, the idea of feminism. But the defense of women does change over time too, and we see a variety of strategies employed, whether it's highlighting the women worthies, as Christine de Pizan and Margarete Fonte do, or to kind of go back to Poulain de la Barre, whether it's starting to discuss the idea of not biological similarities or biological differences, but at the very least to talk about the status of the mind and whether the mind knows or doesn't know sex. So I ask you to conclude with all of this, to think potentially of the implications of going back to the Middle Ages and to the early modern period and seeing the vertiginous highs and lows that are involved in discussing the status of women. And how those lessons, stale as they may seem or distant as they may seem, how they can be applied to discussions relevant to the 20th and 21st centuries too. And that is my conclusion.